Putin's plan is falling apart. Ukraine just turned Russia's greatest offensive into a nightmare. For years, one city has hunted Vladimir Putin more than almost any other in Ukraine: Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, a city sitting barely 30 kilometers from the Russian border, a city Moscow expected to capture in days back in 2022. But 4 years later, Kharkiv still stands, and now in 2026, something extraordinary is happening around it. The very battlefield Russia hoped would become the launchpad for a massive new offensive is rapidly turning into a disaster for the Kremlin. Tonight, we are breaking down how Ukraine flipped Russia's northern offensive upside down, why Putin's buffer zone strategy is collapsing, and how drones, AI warfare, and brutal urban combat are reshaping the future of this war forever. Because what is unfolding right now is not just another battle, it may be the beginning of a much larger strategic failure for Moscow. For Putin, Kharkiv has ever been just another Ukrainian city. It is symbolic. Capturing Kharkiv would allow Russia to place constant artillery pressure on northeastern Ukraine. It will push Ukrainian forces further from the border. It will give the Kremlin a victory it has desperately wanted ever since the humiliating failures in 2022. That is why Russia spent months preparing for a new northern offensive. The goal sounded simple on paper: create a so-called buffer zone around the border region, capture Bumchansk, push Ukrainian forces back, protect Russia's Belgorod region from artillery and drone attacks, and position Russian forces close enough to permanently threaten Kharkiv. But wars are not fought on paper, and Ukraine had other plans. Beginning in late 2025, Russia poured massive resources into the sector. Units from the 69th Motorized Infantry Division were moved into the region. Akhmat forces loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov were also deployed. Russian commanders relied heavily on infiltration tactics, artillery saturation, and relentless pressure. Small assault groups would probe Ukrainian defenses day and night. Drones circled overhead constantly. Artillery pounded defensive positions. The Kremlin believed Ukraine would eventually crack under the pressure, but instead of collapsing, Ukraine counter-attacked, and that changed everything. Between April and May of 2026, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated counter-offensive near Vomchansk that completely disrupted Russia's plan. At the center of the operation was the 23rd Assault Battalion of Ukraine's National Guard. These were not symbolic attacks. These were aggressive, highly coordinated assault operations carried out in one of the most dangerous battlefields in the entire war. Ukrainian assault teams crossed heavily defended Russian positions, cleared trenches, overran company-level fortifications, and pushed deeper into contested territory. This mattered for one major reason. For months, Ukraine had largely remained on the defensive in this sector. Now suddenly, Ukraine was attacking again, and it proved something critical. Despite years of war, despite ammunition shortages, despite relentless Russian pressure, Ukraine still retained offensive capability. That alone shattered one of the Kremlin's biggest narratives. To understand how difficult this operation truly was, you have to picture the battlefield itself. Vomchak is a hell. An entire neighborhood reduced to rubble, buildings torn apart by artillery, roads covered with mines, every street watched by drones, every broken window potentially hiding a sniper. The forests surrounding the town are just as deadly. Every tree can conceal a machine gun nest. Every ditch can hide explosives. Every movement can be spotted from the air. Now imagine trying to attack through that environment. No defense, attack, under artillery fire, under drone surveillance, under sniper threat. This is the kind of battlefield where a single mistake can wipe out an entire assault team in seconds. Yet Ukrainian forces kept advancing. Footage released from the battlefield showed assault units moving through shattered buildings and devastated forest lines while reconnaissance drones guided them forward. FPV drones targeted Russian defensive positions. Infantry units coordinated with support teams in real time. Foreign volunteers, including fighters from Latin America, reportedly joined the operation as well. This wasn't chaos. This was modern warfare evolving in real time. And then came the breakthrough that really alarmed Moscow. Ukrainian forces made a significant advances around the village of Zaporizhia and nearby forest zones. Now here's why this matters. Zaporizhia sits only a few kilometers from the Russian border. That means Ukrainian forces are now operating dangerously close to Russian territory itself. And for the Kremlin, that creates a nightmare scenario. Because once Ukrainian artillery, drones, and reconnaissance systems move that close to the border, Russian military activity on the other side becomes exposed. Supply routes, staging areas, troop movements, fuel depots, all suddenly vulnerable. And while these gains may appear small on a map, in reality, clearing and straightforward defenses is one of the hardest tasks in warfare. Russia has spent months turning these areas into fortified defensive zones. Ukraine forced them out anyway, meter by meter, tree by tree, trench by trench. At the same time, Ukrainian forces conducted additional clearing operations near Vilcha and southeastern Vovchansk. When viewed together, the message becomes very clear. Russia's attempt to establish a stable northern buffer zone is failing, and perhaps even more importantly, Russia is now being forced into a defensive posture in areas where it's expected to dominate offensively. That is a serious strategic embarrassment for the Kremlin, especially because this offensive was supposed to achieve several major goals at once: tie down Ukrainian reserves, prevent Kiev from reinforcing Donetsk, claim new territorial gains, and create propaganda victories for Russian television. Instead, the opposite is happening. Ukraine is forcing Russia to defend itself, and this pressure is not limited to Volchansk. Across the northern eastern front, Ukrainian forces are increasingly applying what analysts describe as an active defense strategy. Here's how it works. Russia attacks, Ukraine absorbs the pressure, then launches localized counterattacks, clears Russian position, fortifies the area, and prepares for the next wave. It is a brutal cycle. Hold, clear, and fortify. Repeat. And with every cycle, Russia loses more momentum. Now let's be clear, these are not massive strategic breakthroughs like the liberation of Kherson back in 2022. Ukraine is not suddenly marching hundreds of kilometers forward. But that is not the point. The real damage is psychological and strategic, because Russia has spent years projecting the image that it holds the initiative everywhere. That time is on Moscow's side. The Ukraine can only defend and slowly retreat. But the battlefield is now telling a different story. Ukraine is still capable of offensive actions, even in sectors where Russia concentrated huge resources. And that changes the entire perception of the war. Meanwhile, further south, another dangerous problem is emerging for the Kremlin. Ukraine is beginning to turn Russia's rare areas into active combat zones. And the weapon changing everything is the drone. For months, Russia relied on a massive logistical network stretching through occupied territory: fuel, ammunition, repair hubs, convoys, heavy machinery, everything needed to sustain a large-scale war. But now, Ukrainian drones are hunting those supply routes deep behind the front lines. One of the most important examples is Mariupol, the city Russia occupied after one of the most brutal sieges of the entire war. Mariupol became a symbol for the Kremlin, a propaganda trophy, proof in Moscow's eyes that Russia could destroy a city, occupy it, and permanently absorb it into its empire. But now Ukrainian drones are appearing around Mariupol itself. Reconnaissance drones, strike drones, FPV drones, tracking Russian military traffic on roads once considered completely safe. And this changes everything about how war works, because logistics depends on predictability. A convoy driver who believes the road is safe behaves one way. A driver who knows drones may strike at any second behaves very differently. Convoys slow down, route change, deliveries delayed, supplies became inconsistent, fear spreads, and slowly the entire logistics system becomes less efficient. This is drone-era interdiction warfare, not fighter jets dominating the skies like NATO campaigns, by swarms of cheap drones creating the same strategic effect, and Russia is struggling to adapt. At the same time, US fighting continues around Pokrovsk and Donetsk Azov. Russia is still pouring enormous manpower into these offensives. The 90th Tank Division has reportedly been concentrated in the region. Russian commanders appear determined to encircle key offensive positions and continue pushing deeper into Donbass. But the cost is staggering. Hundreds of soldiers lost, armored vehicles destroyed, massive artillery expenditure, all for tiny territorial gains. Square kilometers measured in blood. And despite capturing some towns, Russia still has not achieved the decisive breakthrough he desperately wants. That is the hidden crisis inside Putin's strategy. Russia can still attack, Russia can still destroy, but increasingly, Russia cannot convert tactical gains into strategic victory. And while this is happening, Ukraine is rapidly transforming technologically. This war is no longer just trenches and artillery. It is becoming a laboratory of future warfare. Fiber optic drones resistant to electronic jamming are now appearing on the battlefield. AI-assisted targeting systems are being tested. Ground robots are carrying supplies and conducting reconnaissance missions. Autonomous defense systems are being developed to shoot down enemy UAVs. According to Ukrainian sources, tens of thousands of robotic missions were carried out in just the first quarter of 2026 alone. Humans and machines are now fighting side by side, and Ukraine is adapting faster than many expected. So where does this leave Putin? What options does the Kremlin still have? Technically, Russia still holds several cards, but every angle one comes with enormous risk. First, the summer offensive. Russia is clearly preparing to renewed attacks in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. The Kremlin's hopes battlefield gains in the southeast can compensate for failures elsewhere, but this offensive is likely to follow the same brutal pattern: heavy casualties, massive equipment losses, slow progress, and increasingly vulnerable logistics. Second, mobilization. Russia continues to quietly recruit reservists and expand manpower through hidden mobilization waves. But a full national mobilization remains politically dangerous. The last major mobilization triggered panic, protests, and mass departures from Russia. Putin knows this, and he fears domestic instability almost as much as military defeat. Third, the energy war. Russia will almost certainly continue targeting Ukraine's infrastructure during the winter: power stations, heating systems, electrical grids. The Kremlin still hopes civilian suffering can weaken Ukrainian resistance, but Ukraine's air defenses are improving, and Western support continues to expand. Fourth, diplomacy. Putin still holds political pressure in the West will eventually force Ukraine into negotiations. The message from Moscow remains consistent: time is on our side. Accept a deal before things get worse. But the battlefield increasingly undermines that argument. Because if Ukraine is still counter-attacking in 2026, then Russia's claims its unstoppable momentum becomes much harder to sell. And finally, the nuclear card. The threat remains, but after years of repeated warnings, its credibility is weaker than before, because the Kremlin understands something very clearly. Using nuclear weapons would create a consequences far greater than not using them, which means the threat itself is becoming less effective over time. And this brings us to the central reality of the war right now. Putin's strategy is no longer functioning the way it once did. The northern buffer zone is collapsing. Russian rail areas are increasingly vulnerable. The war of attrition is draining enormous resources. and Ukraine continues adapting faster than expected. Does this mean Russia is about to lose tomorrow? No, this war is far from over. Russia remains extremely dangerous. Its military still possesses enormous firepower, and the Kremlin is still willing to sacrifice staggering numbers of soldiers for limited gains. But the assumption that time automatically favors Moscow is no longer guaranteed. That assumption is cracking, slowly, painfully, and visibly. And perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in Vovchansk. For Putin, it was supposed to become the gateway to Kharkiv, a symbol of Russian control, a buffer zone protecting the border, a victory for Kremlin propaganda. Instead, it is becoming a symbol of something very different, a reminder that even after years of war, Ukraine is still fighting back, and that may be the most dangerous development of all for the Kremlin. So now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Ukraine can continue slowing Russia's offensive through drones warfare and localized counterattacks? Or do you think Moscow still has enough manpower and resources to eventually break through? Drop your thoughts in the comment below. And if you want detailed geopolitical analysis, battlefield breakdowns, and the deeper stories shaping this war every single day, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification key. Because the map may change tomorrow, but the story behind it matters even more. And trust me, this story is far from over. Peace be upon you. Thank you.